speech, and I think all this tea made me hungry, and I suppose most of you too. But so we have two options: move all the questions at the end of the afternoon, or ask questions now if you have any, and then again at the end of the afternoon there will still be time for questions regarding both the morning and the afternoon presentations. So if anyone, for instance, has to leave in the afternoon or won't be attending in the afternoon, they may ask their questions now. Or if you plan to stay the whole day, for the duration of the conference, you may be able to ask your questions at the end of the afternoon session. Any question? This silence. Okay, thank you. Yes, please. Would you mind, since we do not have...
You have a microphone?
Yes, we'll soon have a microphone, so don't... Okay. Yes, I understood.
See, there comes a new trend of tea drinking, that is a machine, that's capsule tea machine, and looks like a coffee machine that was product of espresso in Italy. And do you think it's a good way and a new way to promote Chinese tea culture, or it is will be against to the traditional of slow life that is said in tea culture? I will translate it in Italian. Si vede una nuova tendenza del tè, cioè il tè in capsule, come la macchinetta prodotto da Nespresso, e ispirato magari di caffè in capsule. Ma secondo voi questa nuova tendenza sarà un nuovo modo per promuovere la cultura del tè, oppure viceversa? Ok, ecco tutto.
You're addressing your question to which one of us? All of us. Well, frankly, I can hardly see any connection between your question and what we talked about today. Nonetheless, so mine is just a personal. I'm not an expert of tea capsules or the likes. Personally, I find it. I'm even short of words. Definitely something I do not like or encourage. I do not think it's a good way of spreading or promoting tea culture. It's just a different product. It may be the beginning of a new era or a new tendency, but and very frankly, I think different way of consumption can coexist, but it has nothing to do with tea culture as we know it, and so I certainly would no. I don't think it has nothing to do with tea culture the way we are talking about tea culture. It's a novelty, something amusing that may have some, may be practical under certain circumstances, like if you're lost in the woods or in the middle of the desert. But otherwise, I don't see much point. But the same applies to coffee capsules in my opinion. So I may sound maybe too conservative, but that's what I think. Livio or Yumpin?
Maybe I might just add just a consideration. In my presentation, I tried to explain which is for me the difference between tea studies and tea culture studies. Let me say that if we were in tea science or tea studies context, I think these kind of problems about new technology and new products for the market are part of this kind of field of study. Within tea culture studies, it might be interesting for me if this kind of new product becomes a new habit in the future for people, and I would like to study the people who do that, but I'm not interested in the product. So for me, the product is secondary to the focus of my personal research, at least, it is culture of tea and not tea in itself.
I'm from the very more young generation, so I think for me, I would like to learn more about the classic, but there's no classic, so that's why let's experience it and let's make it. And I think the tea consumption right now, especially when the tea has been powderized and in the tea bag, I don't think we should talk about that at all in this conference. And so just forget that. And there's many ways to find your own tea. And I think I don't mind if English colleagues invite me to have cup of tea. They call it builder tea, and to make good relation with them. But on the other hand, I enjoy my cup of tea by myself. So I think that's also self and also situation. That's my suggestion.
Okay, any more questions or remark? Yes.
Thank you. And this question is for you. And as you just mentioned about the cruise, he talked some text mentioning the color is red.
Yes.
So it was written around 1520. It's the reign of Jia Jing.
Yes.
Nearly to the end of the Ming Dynasty. Last night we just discussed with Livio, as you also mentioned, the color is one of the very interesting question to ask because it reflects the evolution of the techniques of making tea by the end of Ming Dynasty. So I'm interested to know what area did the crews travel around and he record this evidence the color is red. So as we know, China is a big area.
Of course.
And maybe simultaneously different kinds of tea already happen in China. So I just want to know when the crews record this sentence, where he experienced this tea.
Yes, it's a very interesting question, and unfortunately I have no answer. That is to say, according to my colleague, he was in Guangzhou for a month. But that is not saying much. I mean, it's not that meaningful. Because it also depends on how the tea was made.
Exactly.
And what kind of tea.
And we speculate we have three kinds of tea as we talked yesterday. And it may be a oolong tea.
Yes.
That will be, the beginning of oolong tea is still a question. We are not certain when it first started to make. And also another question, it may be a black tea. So it is also similar time in Wuyi Mountain, actually.
Yes.
And also it may be aged green tea and we roasted it, like hojicha in Japan now, it become red in color. So I wonder the cruise where he tasted tea or his travel trip or path. And so it will make some sense or make some hints for the investigation of the beginning of oolong tea or black tea in China. So I think the Portuguese first arrived Macau, which is in southern China, in the late Zhengde, or a little bit earlier than 1520. And then I just guess his experiences in southern China or in Fujian. So quite probably it's a very new tea and become red in color. Or it's a habit in the southern China to drink that kind of tea, perhaps even poorer at that time in southern China. So it is very interesting to know where the crews taste the tea and record this a little bitter and the color is red. I just want to know something about
Yes.
that.
There are two other factors to be taken into account. One is what kind of vessel, because the color of tea also changes according to the
Yeah,
kind
sure,
of
sure.
cup or vessel, as you know. I mean, Louis wrote about
Yeah.
about that, as we all know. So, and this is a question. And another question that I, unfortunately, given given the fact I don't know Portuguese, and especially 16th century Portuguese, I would like to know what's the original word used in the Portuguese text for red, because there could be shades of meaning. Could be reddish, or could be brownish. So I would also like to, you know the word, Anis?
Tamalavesh vermelho. Tamalavesh, it means somewhat red.
Somewhat red. you see,
Vermelho is red in
So
Portuguese.
it could be oolong type, yeah.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
And I like this quite because I was in Lisbon in April, and I have idea to look at who he has been invited. This is royal family, emperors, or if it's emperor, I mean Qin Dynasty emperor started to drink oolong tea from Wu Yi. I would say it's really quite popular. But on the other hand, when I look at the paintings in Ming Dynasty, the way is the painter will come from the area with green tea culture. So I wonder what's the missionary layer, the relations with the different the society.
the missionaries were not
Yeah, how you say the
allowed,
influence. Yeah.
certainly not into the
Oh,
court at that point.
Well, the text of the cruise is not something I focus very much on, but for what I know, he had the permission to stay for 1 month in Canton. He was based in Macau, of course,
Yeah,
and he
quite
stayed for 1
close.
in the Canton, and after that,
Yeah.
he wrote his diary, his memories. And I am totally in agree with you in saying that that was for sure some kind of darkened tea, because the color is red. And how it was, black, oolong, or baked, or ripened green tea, that's something I won't be able to answer.
Yes, this is, I'm very interested about that. Thank you.
I have may I?
Oh, sure.
I'm not going to give this up. Livio, may I ask, you said that the earliest secure reference to tea was from the 3rd century?
Yep.
What's the term used? And how
Jia.
do we know it's
Jia.
Chuan.
I think Jia.
Is it in the history of the reign of Wu, one of the 3 reigns of after the Han Dynasty? Margaret knows everything about this, actually, much more than me.
Actually, it's a story about someone being given tea instead of wine. It's a story about a character attending a banquet given by a very demanding host who used to serve huge quantities of tea of wine. But since this person couldn't or wouldn't drink wine, the host, as a sign of respect, instructed the servant to give him tea instead of wine. Yes, but without the other guests knowing, of course. So it was done surreptitiously, and yes, and this is the earliest reliable mention of tea drinking, not tea per se, but tea drinking in a Chinese literary source.
I'm sorry, the term again, which character?
Jia, I think to remember it's.
I don't have my
Jia.
laptop with me. I think it was
Yes,
Jia.
we should look it up, but I think it's Jia. Yes, but this hardly makes any. I mean, in this case you can look it up, but in many other sources, they are known not directly but from a secondary source. And what happens at a certain point, they substitute the original character with Cha, even when Cha didn't exist as a character, because Cha is a relatively new character compared to the earliest. So in collectanea, very often they substitute the original word with the word Cha. But I think in this case, it certainly is not Ming. I think it's certainly not Ming.
It's Jia or Chuan.
It's Jiao Chuan,
One
yes.
of the two.
Thank you.
But give me a few
A
minutes,
few minutes,
and we can look it up.
I will find it.
Yes.
I have a question for Professor Cinese or Professor Zanini. As you know, in the 16th century, in Japan developed the so-called Chanoyu or tea ceremony. And one of the most important Jesuits who was in Japan at that period was expelled from Japan and went to China in the beginning of the 17th century. He was Joao Rodriguez, and in China he wrote the famous Arte do Cha, which is one of the most important treatises on the art of tea in Japan. Now, I would like to know, it's a difficult question, but I would like to know if you know any references in China, in Chinese literature, about the Japanese tea ceremony.
The answer is very simple. No.
No, yes.
No. There is no reference to Japanese
It's
tea
incredible.
culture.
It's really incredible, don't you think?
Well, there were a lot of Japanese stuff arriving to China that period, especially lacquers, blades, swords, a lot of things coming toward unofficial trade from Japan to China that period, because it was officially closed, China also. And only a few threads were still connecting China to Japan. And we find a lot of Chinese books in Japan in that period. For example, the collection of the Chashu Quanji, the Chashu Zenshu, arrived that period. But I never found, at least myself, never found any reference to Japanese tea in Chinese sources. The only exception is the one I discussed about 2 years ago at the colloquium here with you. This Chinese merchant who went to Japan, and he wrote about Japanese tea culture too, but I mean, it is a Kanbun text written by Chinese, but in Japan.
So there is no influence in China from Japanese art of tea. No influence.
No, not that period.
It's
for
very
sure.
surprising. Yes, thank you.
Not, I would say, not until the 20th century via Taiwan.
Taiwan, exactly. Well,
No,
that
but
is
it's
just
hungry.
it's interesting.
It's just me, and yes.
Hello. Regarding the literature, especially...
I'm sorry, I interrupt you for a second.
Sorry.
Don't be shy. Use any language, because we are speaking English, but we are supposed to. But if you have questions to ask in any language we can understand, and I tell you there are quite a lot, then just ask it, and we will somehow translate them. please.
Regarding to literature, both Western and Eastern, I have a very small knowledge, but there is a little, I think for quite some time there has been a little confusion between two terms. One is fermentation and the other one is oxidation. And I was, even if scientifically speaking, it's a long time that the doubts doesn't exist anymore, still I found some some translation from Chinese text and some Western, some text written by Western authors that still, I still found this juxtaposition of words. And could you shine some light on, could you please give us some maybe context whether this conflict originates? Could you shine some light on the origin of the confusion maybe? Thanks.
Well, I would try to answer this question. The problem with the term fermentation is that people talk about wine, tea, or whatever before they invented biochemistry. So at the time they didn't know what was happening in that part of things or whatever. So they would say just something was changing color, and they called that fermentation, or they call that in Chinese fajiao, like bread when it dries or whatever. So it is only after they understood, which is the chemical reaction happening in tea leaves and other parts, that they could understand that one is called oxidation, one is called fermentation. Actually, there is no fermentation in tea, or seasoning or ripening or post and fermentation, as they might call it. But there is no fermentation in terms of the breaking of sugar into alcohol. So there is not that thing. There's just some enzymes working on the polyphenols and oxidizing these polyphenols in one case, and the other one is again oxygen and humidity and other factors that go to oxidize again the polyphenols, but no fermentation. So it is used, it is common. You will find fermented tea, but you just have to know that it is used to say oxidation.
Any more question? Yes.
My question is for Professor Ceresa. You said the Venice was the place where it's all started from a textual references, and I was just wondering when tea as a real thing came to Venice, and if we have any any description of tea once it arrived to the city.
Not that I know. No,
right.
Even if you look at chinoiserie, Venetian chinoiserie, you don't see any sign or any description, representation, or of anybody drinking tea. But on the other hand, if you look at 17th century and 18th century porcelain manufacture in this area, or like Cozzi, for instance, there was a huge exhibition 2 years ago at the Carazzonico Museum, or even if you visit the Carazzonico Museum in itself, you'll see teapots and cups. So supposedly it was consumed that way, or the purpose of those vessels was to make tea. But not even if I think of Venetian paintings like Longhi or other painters who were interested in bourgeois life or in the life of the aristocrats, there's always coffee. Coffee was always much popular, in Italy at least. But no, I wouldn't say no. I don't really know. So the interest was merely intellectual, I would say, at that point. And but tea must have been drunk. Otherwise, you wouldn't see the reason for all those teapots and cups. But otherwise, no. I really have no. When it comes to Venice, no, definitely not. But even in general, if you look at literature, I mean, not historical literature, but fiction, for instance, there's very little mention. You have in take 17th, 18th, 19th century a lot about coffee, drinking coffee, poems about coffee. A very famous, important literary journal, Il Caffè, was named after coffee. But there's very little concerning tea.
Thank you.
Actually, I have a question for Professor Zhou. It's about the 大观茶论, the treatise by the Emperor Huizong. Because I never went too much in deep in that text. There's something fascinating about that. I don't know if anything about that emperor and his personal experience of tea, because no matter what, the text seems to be very technical. And I just wonder, how could an emperor at that time, maybe it was Nansong or Peisong at that, Peisong, so in Kaifeng, how could have that knowledge of the production of tea in the imperial gardens? I don't know if you have any.
I think he is more really, there's another question I ask myself, even literati, could they make tea, or could they really describe tea, or they just write poetry? I think Song Huizong, he had a very good officer, the Cai Jing, and in fact, Cai Jing was born in Fujian province, and this almost like culture and minister. So he had, I think, a lot of the idea developed this tea competition in Jianyang, in Fujian, especially northern Fujian province. So I think the relationship between emperors and his officers were very important, the communication in the court. So I found this is fascinating about, now we talk about the distance. In fact, there was not really quite big distance in north or south. I think tea came from south, not from that area. But I think he had developed complete more like performing art than the really taste. So his writing, I think, about area was very correct about this mist. And I think it's on from his Cai Jing's.
You never went yourself to Fujian Sea to overview?
I don't see. It's like tea merchants. They are based in Xiamen, or they didn't really visit tea gardens, and so that's another quite important thing about tasting tea. We are not in the farming area. How can we improve? How can we improve our abilities?
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
A Napoli esiste il Palazzo Venezia, che è la residenza dell'ambasciata veneziana a Napoli. Diciamo che dal 1450 fino al 1750 è stata sede dell'ambasciata veneziana a Napoli, e all'interno del cortile c'è una sala da tè. Quindi
È quella di Benedetto Croce? Quella,
sì, è quella
okay.
di Benedetto Croce. È una casina vanvitelliana adibita a sala da tè. Quindi per rispondere a prima.
I can translate they say that in Napoli there is a palace called Palazzo Venezia. There was the former embassy of the Venetian Republic at the court of the Borboni, and in that place there is a tea room, tea pavilion, tea room. So there might be some tea at the time.
Poi una cosa sul Royal Garden di Wuxia. Nel Royal Garden di Wuxia sono conservate, mi sembra, 850 cultivar diverse di Yansha, saranno poi Yansha. Dice che le stanno incominciando a recuperare, perché ovviamente col tempo sono state utilizzate esclusivamente quelle più commerciali, da Paolo, Wui, Geluan e così via. E niente, volevo sapere se era iniziato questo processo, perché qualche anno fa, devo dirlo in inglese.
So, okay. In inglese vado io. So the question is about the varieties of tea still preserve the royal, she said, the royal garden at the Wishan. I think you might talking about the place where the 4 trees of Tao Pao are still there. In that place, you mean?
Yeah.
No. Uh-huh. It's not Jiulongkang. No, it's near. Okay. Okay. So there's a place where they still preserving more than 800 different varieties of tea, and as Giuseppe Musello was there a few years ago, they said they were saying that they are going to restore the production of some of these varieties, as till now only the most commercial one have been used. So do you know anything about any update on this project?
Sorry, can you say again?
Do you have any information about the new development of this rescue of these old varieties of tea?
I found this is all the reference. I mean, that has been quite kept by Chinese tea maker. But that's the another problem as we talk about the scientific research right now in China. They farmers or the makers may they discover some the earlier species. They start to make tea, but I wonder, can we trust? Is any so I really question about the reference right now, because the 800 is from 1942. No, I haven't got any further.
Any more questions?
And I just want to add one thing. In those part of Fujian province, in fact, a lot of tea maker farmer moved from Jiangxi province during Qin Dynasty to that region. So they also grow not just they were not just making on particular one kind of tea, and I think we have to rethink this our definition about the yan cha only in one particular area, and Wu Yi tea consists of different area. So and to look back the way of making tea in Qin Dynasty, teapot, what kind of the size or what really the method, I think I would be more intriguing.
Any more question? Yes.
Thanks. I have a second question, maybe not that still be like the first one. Okay, I have a question to Professor Marco Ceresa. You have mentioned that there are some Jesuits that they have some mentions and notes on their books about Chinese tea or Chinese tea drinking. I have noted that there are some in these documents about Martina Martini.
Yes.
But I
Which
haven't saw the.
I didn't mention on purpose.
Yeah.
There's a controversy in Martino Martini, and he's the one who's doubting the good effects of tea, and actually he thinks that, contrary to what everybody else says, he thinks that tea is not good for you, and there's quite a controversy. I didn't mention it first because I didn't want to take too much time, and second because my idea was just to lead the way to tea consumption in Europe and not opening any. But you are absolutely right. Yes, Martina Martini wrote about tea, and there's actually a controversy concerning the effects of tea. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. And another about, are there some notes or mentions about Michele Ruggeri?
Yes.
I
So you're
don't know.
into Jesuits, aren't you?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm doing the research about Michele Ruggeri and Martina Martini.
Yes.
I am looking for some
And now I
resources.
know who you are. Yes, 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 yes. You're one of the PhD candidates.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's me. So have we found some resources about the Michele Ruggeri, about the something maybe he have mentioned about Chinese tea, or no?
No, Michele
No.
Ruggeri, no.
Oh.
No.
Never.
Martino Martini, in any case, is interesting because I just read a small part. It seems the description of the processing of the leaves by him is very similar to those you can find in the text written by the Ming literati in that period. It is like pan-roasted green tea, like those in the find in charu or chashu, those texts.
Thank you very much.
So I have if there are no more questions, are there any more questions? I have a very quick question for Livio. First, I mean, your very detailed bibliography for me was like a walk down memory lane, because actually I was there when those books came out, and I owned the first edition, and some of them were written by friends who are sadly no more there. But I wonder, first I was surprised, because I hardly ever look back at all that, but they were a lot and they were few at the same time. So I mean, a lot has been written and yet not enough on the subject. It was just a remark. And second is, we tend, but I think this is a trend, to look at, of course, Chinese sources or Japanese sources and English language sources. But I wonder, and I somehow suspect, that there has been some work done in Russian, and for sure, because I remember having seen, and I maybe in some hidden corner of my library, I may even have some work in Russian. For sure, a bibliography on works on tea in Russian, and also I wonder if there's any work having done in German on the history of tea. But this is just a curiosity. And since sinology was very active in Eastern Europe in let's say the first half of the 20th century, I wonder also about languages like Czech or of course they are not so easily accessible or common languages, but it may be worth looking into that too, just as a suggestion.
Sure. Well, if it might be an answer to this, yes, they wrote a lot in China. They published a lot about tea, but most of what has been published in China does not fit any academic standard, let me say. It's just a lot of books saying that Shen Nu invented tea and whatever, and then they teach you how to brew tea, that's all. So there are a lot of titles, but serious scholarship is still something precious and difficult to find. So, but they have a lot also serious scholarship, and you have to be able to understand what is worth reading, what is not worth reading. About Eastern Europe, I didn't mention today, but I know that there is a translation of the Cha Jing in Russian For sure. I don't have my laptop here, so I cannot tell you the name of the two translator, the two sinologists. And I don't know anything about any other language. I don't know anything about German. I know about French. I don't know anything about other languages.
Okay, that was it.
I have a quick question for both of you in the language, the translation. I have really tried to look at the missionary and they pick up every term they use. I mean, now they have written tea, but sometimes the tea is half tea, means maybe half break. Maybe mean have a leisure time, have tea or tea. Tea doesn't just mean the tea, we are drinking tea. It's also, do you think it's also sometimes translation more like in English term they call have tea, it just have a break for half hour. So what in Italian translation, is there any more meaning beyond just the tea tasting?
I think I understand your question. But as you see, in the sources, at least in the sources I have shown today, I mean, as I said, I do not really read Portuguese, but I'm able to identify words in Portuguese for sure. And I do understand Latin quite well, and they hardly ever say tea, not even in the Latin form. It's always chai, cha, or some word that reproduces the sound of the original word. Where if they wanted to say, let's have a break, they would have used, I suppose, another expression and not a technical, difficult word for tea. So I think that when they mentioned chai or cha or chia, they meant cha or chai or cha. Whether that is tea may be another question, although I think we can be pretty sure. But maybe not, but for sure it was not a metaphor. It was not an expression or a way of saying, let's have a break. Whereas on the other hand, I wouldn't mind having lunch at this point.
That's right.
So I think, thanks everybody for attending. Okay, so...
I would suggest starting at 2:30, since otherwise we just have half an hour for lunch and arranging everything for the afternoon. Thank you.